Hey everyone, welcome to our first day of our Test Kitchen webinar series. My name is Amanda Brief. I'm our Senior Event Marketing Manager here at Right Side Up, and I'm so thrilled to kick off our webinar series this week. So for today, on day one, we're going to be sharing a panel discussion on how to build an experimentation-first marketing culture. But before we get started, just wanted to quickly share a little bit about Right Side Up if you're not familiar with us. So we are a collective of marketing specialists who have helped more than 1,000 companies grow their business. So we have expertise across kind of every facet of marketing, from SEO to social to creative, just to name a few. So if you are interested in learning more about Right Side Up, you can go to our website at rightsideup.com. But enough about us. Let's go ahead and run through our Test Kitchen webinar series for this week. So as I mentioned before, today we'll be sharing a panel discussion on how to build an experimentation-first marketing culture. Tomorrow, we have a presentation on testing frameworks for today's top marketers. And then lastly, on Thursday, we're going to wrap it up with another panel discussion on how to evaluate and prioritize marketing channels for experimentation. So I left a little QR code up on the screen. So if you scan that, it leads you to a blog post with some more information about today's and this week's webinar series. All right, I would be remiss if I didn't walk through our housekeeping slides. So real quickly, please note everyone except our panelists are muted. However, if you have any questions for the panelists, feel free to throw them in the Q&A box. And I always recommend that we want to keep these webinars interactive. So if you have any questions for the other attendees or want to throw out any comments, feel free to use the chat box throughout the webinar. And then lastly, an email with the link for the recording will be sent out tomorrow or today, probably in a couple of hours. So if you do want to rewatch it or share it with any colleagues, look out for the email in your inbox. All right, so I'm going to have everyone kind of do a quick intro in a bit, but just wanted to quickly highlight our panelists for today. So I'm excited to have Mark Okion, our GM of Full-Time Recruitment, moderating today's webinar. And he'll be joined by Chelsea Kramer, Marketing Analytics Manager for Credit Karma, Danny Lannon, Senior Growth Consultant for Right Side Up, as well as Ben Zettler, Founder and Marketing Advisor for Zettler Digital. So excited to have everyone on the panel. And like I said, they'll do a quick intro at the end, or not at the end, in the beginning. So with that, before I hand it off to Mark, wanted to throw out kind of a random icebreaker question related to our Test Kitchen webinar series. So I might throw it off to you, Mark, to answer first. So what is the weirdest but surprisingly delicious food combo you've ever tried or invented?
Yeah, so this one was actually really recent. It was about 2 weeks ago. We had a recipe at my house where we tried chicken, but it was combined with like reduced peaches and mustard, which I was told after the fact, because if someone told me beforehand, I probably wouldn't have tried it. But when I tried it, it was surprisingly good. So it was funny that you asked this question because it just happened 2 weeks ago and there's a new recipe we tried. But yeah, it was really good. Doesn't sound like it would be good, but it was a good combo.
Yeah, definitely. And if anyone on the call right now has any other kind of random combos they want to throw out there, feel free to put them in the chat. I see a few coming in. So Chelsea, I see Wendy's Frosty and chicken nuggets. I agree with that one. Emmanuel's in mustard or Dijon mustard. I think that's in relation to
I think it was
your.
Dijon. I think it was Dijon.
Okay. I would say, do you like regular mustard too? I know that's always kind of a hit or miss for people.
Yeah, I'm a mustard lover. I love mustard.
Nice. Cinnamon baked on pizza. Absolutely. I will say I'm a huge proponent of pineapple on pizza, but I know that is a very controversial topic as well. So if you do like pineapple pizza or Hawaiian pizza as well, feel free to throw that in the chat. Love to see who's in favor of it or who's, kind of a hateful person when it comes to that. Um, let's see. Danny says, I second the salty sweet. Absolutely. Cool. All right. Well, once heard of marshmallows on a hot dog. I'm not sure how I feel about that one, but
Just say pineapple on pizza, marshmallow hot dog like 6 minutes in, or we're getting controversial.
All right. Well, maybe without further ado, if anyone has any other kind of random combos they want to throw out there, feel free to put them in the chat. But with that, I'm going to hand it off to Mark, and I'll be back later to wrap up today's webinar. Enjoy, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, so just to introduce myself, I'm Mark. I'm the GM of full-time recruitment here at Right Side Up, and then introduce our panelists as well. So we'll start off with Chelsea.
Hey everyone, my name is Chelsea Kramer and I lead paid marketing measurement at Credit Karma. Basically, what my job is making sure that the hundreds of millions of dollars a year that we're spending is spent efficiently. So, know a lot about experimentation and really excited to talk about it today.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. Danny.
Hey everybody, I'm Danny. Been working with Right Setup for about 7 years now. Been in marketing for about 18 years, ranging from places like Apple Music to Samsung TV to AI SaaS startups. So happy to be here and provide some insight any way I can.
Great, thank you. And then last but not least, Ben.
Hey everybody, pleasure to be here. I'm Ben Zettler. I'm the founder of Zettler Digital. We are a digital marketing and e-commerce agency, primarily focused on e-commerce brands, but we also work with some other types of businesses as well. We have been longstanding Shopify Premier partners for the last decade or so. We're also heavily involved in email and SMS services and our Klaviyo Elite partners and do advertising. So happy to be here.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, we'll get into some Q&A here. I'm super excited to kick off the conversation. And I think this is super important to kind of kick off our webinar series to talk about building the culture for experimentation. The topic super relevant, right? We're all in fast-moving markets. It's really easy for teams to fall back on what's always worked before and familiar playbooks. But in reality, everything's moving really quick, and what worked yesterday won't necessarily work for today or for tomorrow. So our audience is constantly changing how they absorb information, and that's like channel and tactics and campaigns in general, where they're spending their time, and what captured people's attention in the past is shifting all the time. So if we're not experimenting, we're not learning. And if we're not learning, we're falling behind. But I think more importantly, if you're not doing it, your competitors are doing it. And I think that's just something to bake into the culture from early on. And as kind of alluded to before, it's not just about optimizing headlines or adjusting creative. It's about pushing your teams to ask, what if we did this differently, and really build a culture of curiosity, adaptability, and continuous improvement. So with that in mind, let's talk about how orgs can rethink traditional measurement models to better support a culture of learning and innovation. So our first question, where do you see the gaps that traditional measurement tools they can't really fill in today? So gaps that current measurement tools don't really satisfy. Chelsea, I'll ask you to kick off here.
Yeah. So when I think about like traditional measurement, I'm thinking about clicks. I'm thinking about channels that have a click and then the tracking that comes at the end of that link that people click on. So I think where the gaps are on channels where there isn't a click. So things like TV, out of home, those are much harder to measure, or where there's strategies where there's not a click. Things like awareness-based campaigns and things like that. So I think that's part of it. And then in terms of the tracking, what we're seeing now is with privacy changes, a lot of that tracking's getting cut off from our links. So, that's big in the iOS world. It's definitely been a headache for me, especially recently. But, it's kind of these gaps where we don't necessarily have insight into the actual performance because, we don't know how things are performing on a click level. So where I'm seeing the change there is, a lot of companies are moving more towards model-based measurement, things like, media mix modeling, more causal inference techniques, things that people with PhDs can talk about all day. And things like incrementality testing where you're just not as dependent on the click. So these more sophisticated, statistics techniques are where like the really big brands are starting to move.
Yeah, I personally have heard quite a bit about that when talking to candidates and clients. So candidates who have that experience or getting it, and clients looking for that experience when looking for marketers and data people to join their team, specifically MMM. So that's really helpful. Does anybody else, Danny, Ben, you have anything you want to add to that? We can go on to the next one.
I'd say really quickly, just
Yeah.
in my context with working with a lot of e-commerce brands, so folks with probably significantly smaller budgets compared to what Chelsea's typically working with, it becomes a lot harder to do some of this, I'll call it like broader measurement, where you're not so reliant as what many folks used to be on last click attribution from your advertising or from other marketing channels that you're leveraging. I think it's forced in a way over the last couple of years with iOS 14.5 and every other iteration since then, and all the different privacy changes that every browser and system is using or has implemented. It's forced brands to think a little bit more holistically about their business, about where are they spending money in advertising, and how does that factor into the broader picture of their product cost and their operating cost, and how much money are we making, and how much money are we spending, and how much is left over. I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years that a lot of brands are rightfully so getting smarter about that conversation. They're at least having that conversation. Whereas before it was, yeah, what's my ROAS on a Facebook ad? And like, doesn't really mean much anymore because there's so many different interconnected parts and things that impact performance that you have to think a little bit more, again, broadly across the business.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that a little bit, you see, if you're looking at last click attribution, for example, and you're kind of understanding, hey, my, like Ben said, my ROAS is dipped, and you're not looking holistically at the entire kind of set of channels that you're running with, and kind of the end result data. So, in terms of what are your profits, what are your total sales, and then how do you look at, the creative fatigue in an account to kind of also tie back into that kind of customer model and where, what position the channel plays in the overall attribution measurement, and coupling that, alongside, customer surveys and kind of first party data that you have to try and squeeze as much out of it as you can. There's just, it's, like Ben said, there's just not as much where you can rely on a single platform's data to kind of understand what's going on. You have to look at the picture holistically across all the channels you're running.
Yeah, that's a great segue. I read from that like when we talk about traditional measurement tools, it's the platforms, right? Where it's like what the platforms say that they're doing. Um, but that's a super great segue, Danny, because the next question I was going to ask is about multi-touch and multi-channel. So I'd love to know how the shift to a multi-channel landscape has made attribution harder. But specifically, I would love to know how you're coping with it or helping your clients cope with that as they're thinking about how to measure first versus last versus middle touches, um, channels that are influencing but maybe not have a direct attribution method. That'd be super interesting to understand how you guys are dealing with that. So, Ben, you want to take this one?
Yeah, and another piece I didn't mention that really kind of flipped this whole thing I've said in the last couple of years is the elimination of Universal Analytics by Google Analytics and GA4. And there are two very like distinct camps of people that either love what GA4 can do, generally on a more technical level, versus the majority of everybody else that can't stand the platform because it's not the same. Go in, see your channels. Okay, last click attribution for the most part, even though you could do some modeling in there. And then you kind of have your theoretical answer on what channel drove what sale or what action, I should say. So today, I actually like lean the way of ignoring some of that like multi-touch or just attribution measurement method model, and to go back to what I mentioned before of like very simply looking at how much money have you spent and how much money have you made and what's the amount left over? And I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but those are the conversations that we have because the the types of clients that we're working with, which could be anywhere from uh, typically anywhere from like $1 to $10 million a year. That's like our core customer. Many of them are very sensitive to cost on the tools like, uh, in my world, a triple whale that's gotten really popular over the course of the last few years. And they can do a lot of really incredible things inside of that tool, including modeling that can help you determine what channels are having impact in certain places. But I've had more conversations in the last year with brands that are thinking about, well, what can I do to report on performance for my business without being so reliant on these third-party tools that cost anywhere from 500, 600, 700, 1,000, $1,500 a month? Um, and so how much money are we spending? How many new customers are we bringing in? How much revenue is from new customers specifically becomes a really big focus. And we may do like holdout testing to get an understanding if we're shutting off spend in a certain place and what the overall broader impact on the business is. And once we kind of have some of those answers, I suppose, and some of those like kind of longer term trends, then we can have a pretty good understanding of if we're shutting things on or off, what the impact will be. I hope that's the best non-answer that I can give.
No, that's interesting. So do you also get an idea of scale? So like if you shut a channel off, you understand that it's definitely having impact. Do you also have a good idea at the level of spend that you're at that like, hey, we could probably increase our mix from 20% to 50% in this channel and then try that?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, it's going to vary brand to brand, and something that actually factors in now more so than ever is creative iteration. Like, what assets do we have that we can actually
Yeah.
pump into an account if we're going to even have the conversation of, yeah, let's spend 20% more, let's spend 50% more, let's double the spend that we're making right now, which I generally don't advise folks to do unless they are prepared with the content to cycle in. Um, it's just different, at least in my experience from a few years ago when, we might have a client that we did some advertising for and, I'm happen to be scrolling on Instagram and then I see an ad that a year prior we put in place for them that they're still running, even though we might not be working with them anymore because they're running it themselves. And you could sort of get away with that today, but not the way that you could before. Um,
Yeah.
and so creative iteration and the assets that you have and the resources that you have to create new content really becomes a big part of that conversation. Um, and that will kind of dictate results do, of course, that'll kind of dictate how much more we might consider spending on an account.
It's funny. That's like a completely universal thing. As I hear like Chelsea talk about the inflection point that her business is at with the budget, and then like the clients you work with, Ben, is very different. But I think wherever people are at, if you're on the front lines on paid social, especially, it's like high volume of creative iteration is a constant. That's great. So when I think about the culture specifically, what do you feel like an experimentation culture looks like in practice? Certainly in a marketing team, because that's the front line, but like org wide, what does that look like? Um, Ben, let's go back to you.
Whenever I get a question like this, I think back to my experience at my old job prior to starting the agency. I worked for a company called Steiner Sports. Steiner is the largest autographed sports memorabilia company of its kind in the world. They were 6 years ago. They were bought out by Fanatics, and it still technically operates today, but under the Fanatics umbrella. But it was very much an environment where you had the freedom to really do anything that you wanted to, as long as it had the potential to maybe garner some attention and make money. So it was a fairly, as a work environment, a fairly like sort of ruthless environment, but you had that freedom. And so when like interesting opportunities came up or when somebody had an idea, we knew that there was kind of this freedom to operate. And I think that is kind of where this starts. It's the culture that I hate the word culture because it sounds so like buzzwordy, but truly the culture that a company creates and cultivates and makes it abundantly clear and makes it known to the people that, hey, if you have an idea, bring it forward. And a good example of that, the reason why I think of this is it's almost football season, and this was back a few years ago. And funny enough, they still have their own the same kind of problems. But the Cleveland Browns have cycled through the numbers over 20 something starting quarterbacks in the course over the course of the last 20 years. Um, and so I can't take credit for it. I can't remember who it was internally on our team, but somebody had the idea of um, let's do a trade-in program. Anybody that has a card, a jersey, a something from one of these players, send it to us and we'll give you $100 gift card. No, like no questions asked, basically. Um, and it was something that immediately garnered attention and got us to the front page of ESPN and Fox Sports and Yahoo, like everywhere, Bleacher Report, cycled all around, got a couple thousand submissions, had us giving out a lot of credit, but at the end of the day, um, became an actual revenue driver for the business because for the folks that were going to use their $100 off, average order value is typically a couple $100 for us anyway. So it really kind of worked out. Now, some lessons learned, like we gave people 2 weeks to submit things. So you had a lot of people that are like buying random stuff on eBay for $2 and then trying to send multiples into us from different addresses. And it was kind of like a whole mess. Um, but still, it's something that, you have to have the right, um, I guess the right product, the right brand, in addition to just kind of encouraging your team and empowering your team to come to the table with ideas. Like there has to be a fit there for the brand too, for sure. But when you have that, then fun things like that can kind of come together.
Hmm. That's great. Um, I think about, you mentioned triple whale. Like I hear about tools a lot. I hear more and more tools pop up every time I talk to people. I'd love to know why you think so many organizations rely too heavily on tools, dashboards, things like that, versus building a mindset of experimentation and being a little bit more loose about parameters. Danny, if you have thoughts there.
Yeah, so I think, I love tools. I'm as big of a, user as anybody else. I think the challenge is it's really easy to get comfortable with the data they're giving you. You end to take it, at face value. A lot of the times you're relying on, oftentimes them just connecting through an API to the platform you're already using anyways, and then coming up with new models to kind of rearrange that information for you. That's not the case for all of them, but it depends on the brand and kind of what your goals are and what your targets are and kind of what you're measuring. But I think it's also really important to go a little bit deeper and look at kind of what's going on within your ad campaigns, for example. So, looking at a dashboard in Triple Whale is not going to help you figure out why your creative is fatigued or why your creative strategy or copy strategy isn't performing, or looking at your, map of your geo targeting to understand kind of which markets you should be exploring. It may give you some insight into that, but I think a lot of that comes from the tests that you put in place yourself, and also being very kind of prescriptive about how you schedule testing throughout the business and throughout your kind of creative campaigns. So oftentimes I think I use the dashboards as a baseline, and then I try to dive in a little bit deeper to kind of map out my testing strategies and see where lift comes when I'm running those, on a week by week basis. And I think it also leads into having, people maintain ownership of those tests so that you can push that forward, in a way that the entire team can understand outside of just feeling comfortable with the dashboard.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Ben, Chelsea, you guys have anything you want to add to that? No.
I'm good.
I
I agree with a
I,
lot of what Danny said there.
Yeah, I will tell you, there's a term that's called solutions focused versus tool focused that I heard a CEO one time years ago say that I've always really liked, is that for his particular scope of what he was looking for in a marketing ops leader, it's like I'm looking for someone who is solutions focused and not tool focused. So when you talk to someone and all they talk about is which tools they use and can use and want to use, they're probably married to the tool and not really thinking about the solution that the tool solves for. So anyway, it's something that's pretty common.
And I think the tools also put you in a box, right? Like
Yeah,
you're only able to kind of work within the confines of the tool. So a lot of that experimentation that we're talking about today, like it's hard to apply that in this sense. I mean, I think you got to look at, like I said, your creative process, if it's ad creative or copy, how your website's working in conjunction with what are your competitors doing, and kind of doing deeper analysis there as well. So one thing that I do a lot of is I will take, say if it's e-com, for example, actually this applies to every type of business, but you take all of the data points that you can find, reviews, social comments, as you know, many thousands of data points as you can on all your competitors as well as your own brand. And then you can kind of cross-analyze the different triggers that you see represent positive, neutral, and negative sentiment. And then that allows you to kind of formulate, testing further and get more into the granular elements of what might be working for your competitors or yourself and where that crosses over. And then that can help educate, maybe your strategy on copy or creative or, CRO, for example.
yeah, that's great. Awesome. So I want to move on to like how we think about teams and structure of the teams, like who's responsible for what, who's hired what, like who's doing what in the team. So how should marketing teams be structured around specifically building an experimentation culture? So how can organizations foster a culture that supports testing and learning by virtue of who's in place and what their responsibility is? Um, Chelsea, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it works best when experimentation is a part of everyone's day to day versus, siloed to, a single person who's really focused on it. And I think where I've seen this work really well in practice is consistency in terms of things like share outs and meetings. Maybe it's a monthly, experiment wins or whatever it is. Also, just like Google Docs of like, here's what we tested, here's what we learned. And that Google Doc just grows and grows and grows. And then that serves as a good place to get ideas for future experiments because maybe you did tested it on Facebook and now you want to test something on Google. And as I feel like an analytics person who will be looking at the data, trying to make sense of it, seeing a long list of learnings makes it easy for me to try and bring things together of, okay, we've seen this work and we've seen this work. So maybe that means we'll see this work in the future, or give us ideas for, where we want to dive a little bit deeper into the data. So yeah, I definitely think in terms of like building that in, it's all about the docs and the share outs for me.
Yeah. Well, it seems encouraging, right? Like if you're a person that reads what everybody else is experimenting with in the company, it should be encouraging for you to say like, wow, people are taking some risks, people are doing a lot of stuff. Like maybe I have that kind of permission to do it myself, which I think is a really good way to do that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think too, like my role sits within finance. So ultimately, when I'm looking at what we're testing, I want to make sure that it's safe enough at the end of the day relative to our revenue risk. So, as a starting point, like organizationally, trying to understand like how much of our budget are we willing to be flexible with? If, it only performs half as well as what we're doing currently, is that okay that we take that revenue hit or that sales hit or whatever it is? So starting with that sometimes when you're first building up this type of culture can be helpful so that you're not caught in trouble, a month later because you tested something and it impacted the business too much, which I've absolutely done before. And it's not fun to have a CFO asking where a couple $1 million are. So yeah, highly don't recommend that.
Yeah. It only took us 31 minutes into the webinar to get to the CFO conversation and the
Yeah,
budget.
sorry.
No, it's all good. I think it's great. Perfect. Danny and Ben, do you guys have anything to add to that?
Um, I agree. I think that, if you can kind of test within some confinement, so to speak, so like, hey, in this quarter, we're going to be testing, creative, we're going to be testing PDP, we're going to be testing, whatever those, components are. And that way you can at least understand, how much leeway you have within that kind of testing environment and how, leadership is comfortable with that testing. And so then you can go, and I agree with Chelsea again about having, weekly scrums about new ideas and kind of shared, hive mind kind of thoughts with your team, so that no idea is a bad idea. You can have someone may find some strategy that you've never heard of that sounds interesting, that they've, maybe some media buyer friend of theirs, it's working great. I have some examples in that where I've seen that a ton of times. And so, just leaving the door open, having some key kind of test confinements that you're going to work within, making sure you're not testing too many things at once, and then, you know, making sure that everyone understands what the goals are of each test so you can track them quickly and move fast.
Yeah, I think that's great. That actually goes into my next question, which was about concrete goals. Um, what are some concrete goals that companies should define to guide their experimentation practices? Or do you think that companies should have concrete goals, right? Or are concrete goals too restrictive? But yeah, would love thoughts on that.
I think that with kind of the concrete goals, I mean, you have to have a goal in your test. So that's a step one, I think. And if you don't have that, then you oftentimes end up missing a lot of the components and data that you need to improve on whatever you're trying to test. But um, you know, there's a certain confinement in that testing environment and these strategies, because you have to be able to move forward and make something actionable. So it's super important to kind of do that. But I think that, it's really just depends on the business and what you're trying to do. So if you're a SaaS company and you're seeing a dip after asking for phone number verification, post sign up, for example, during the onboarding flow, maybe you move that as a first stage and kind of seeing how that impacts your acquisition, for example. Or if you're ecom, maybe you want to add 10 UGC creatives per week, and start to test individuals. Does John perform better than Carly? And if John performs better, do you scale that person out to produce more creative for you? And, then even going a step further and testing the kind of thematics that they're producing. So, there's no shortage of kind of testing. So I think that as long as you have some confines, you can definitely build out a pretty robust, targeting goal for it.
Oh, that's great.
And I think some of the things you're saying ladder up into like the general idea that I have for a learning agenda, which is basically questions that help frame your test. So if you're looking at something like, does John perform better than Carly? If you start with that question before you spend $1 or launch a landing page or whatever it is, you start with that question, then you say like, okay, perform, what does that mean? Does that mean we're getting more sales? Does that mean we're getting more clicks? And starting with that questions can help you design that test in a way that once the test is over in a week or a month, that you come back to that question and you have a yes or no answer, or you have the answer that helps you learn something to move forward. So that's always where I like to start in terms of not like specific goals, but how we actually design tests to begin with.
Yeah, it's super important. I know everybody on this panel has experience, but with this, but like probably the worst thing is wasting time and money on a test where it wasn't set up in the beginning to be successful, where it was big enough maybe to have a variance at the end, where it's just like the question mark, where at the end of a test you're just shrugging your shoulders, like the very least you just wasted a month on the test where we couldn't learn anything, which is the worst.
Yeah. And then I'm just asked to analyze results and I'm like, I can't do anything with this.
Chelsea's got personal pain. She's like, well,
Yes.
bring
Yeah,
me in the beginning when you're designing the test, and then I can help you at the end.
exactly. Yeah, you're bringing in my trauma into this webinar.
Oh, sorry. Well, we'll go off. Well, I would say the next subject may or may not give anybody more trauma. So we're going to move on from like a culture conversation to more executive buy-in, which I alluded to earlier. Is like, I mean, me personally, when I was doing marketing, like this is this is where a lot of the experiment culture was either cultivated or killed, right? Was the executive buy-in. But I'd love to know what are the most common objections that you've heard from leadership about experimentation, and even just having the culture around that. How have you convinced skeptical stakeholders that experimentation is worth the investment?
I can remember plenty of times where I've had conversations with folks for thinking about more like technical tests, like uh, A/B testing elements on a product page, um, and actually having run something to prove out kind of like smaller proof of concept of, hey, this change and this was the impact that we can reasonably, reasonably assert. Uh, Impacted performance in such a way, and this is the next test that we want to run, and here's why. And you could, sometimes you can make your case all day, every day, as much as you can, but if someone's of the opposite opinion, that doesn't matter. There's no way that we can actually realistically measure impact. Sometimes it's a tough conversation to have, because if a decision maker uh, doesn't have buy-in with you, then nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to progress forward. Um, so I think this culture of experimentation, whether it's again on the more technical side or even on the just kind of wacky marketing idea side, like the example I gave before, like it, uh, I think it only happens like top down. Like I think you're setting a certain expectation level um, when you are that decision maker, and if you're giving people that you're working with and that are working for you the freedom to come up with ideas and to build a test case and create a hypothesis around something, and then want to go in and implement that test, whether it be again something on the website, whether it be um, more of a content centric test for advertising, or whether it be one of those wacky marketing ideas, like um, people have to know that they have a little bit of a leash to do that, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's great. Danny?
Yeah, I think that oftentimes what I've heard is we already know what works, or we don't have enough budget, or we're fine with where we're at. And it's I think the biggest thing that you can do, and one of the things I like to say too, is that one, you don't know what you don't know, and two, that somebody's always working 10 times harder than you somewhere else, somewhere. And so how do you stay ahead of the curve on that? And the only way to really do that is testing. And you don't get, you don't grow, you don't get larger, you don't find better results without trying new things. You can't kind of stay stagnant. Marketing moves, it's fluid, platforms change, habits of buyers change, product changes. So that's kind of the first point. And then looking at kind of case studies around, things that are similar to the test that you want to implement, or maybe they're the same and you just haven't tried it. And trying to back it up with an explanation of data around why you should try this. And then also looking at, how channels are performing internally. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've seen brands, that are killing it on Facebook for acquisition, and then Facebook plummets, and now they're going from, a 2.5 ROAS on a 150K spend a day to, tanking and barely making enough, to keep the business afloat. And so it's also a security measure to be able to, test different things and grow, and then also start testing other platforms so you can redistribute, your performance across other places.
Yeah, to diversify. Yeah, it's nobody wants all their eggs in one basket. I think sticking with that, like, do you use success stories, or have you used success stories to help leaders and executives get comfortable with this idea, whether that's like success stories from other clients you've had or competitors, like when you can point to someone else, like your Meta example. It's like, this competitor that you admire kind of diversified some of their budget clearly from Meta to this other channel, to YouTube maybe. But yeah, have you pointed to any other success stories to kind of successfully convince these folks to change their approach to it?
Absolutely. You know, I was working for an ecom brand. They were driving 60 mil ARR in the beauty space, and I transitioned out of that to a AI SaaS startup that was formulated at Google, and they had just been focused on Google search ads, and we're seeing a really high CAC, much higher than they would like, and wasn't aligning with their budgets. And I came in with a Spark ad strategy for TikTok, which is not the normal for a SaaS company. And through that, we dropped their acquisition by almost 90%, just through kind of more non-traditional SaaS marketing. And so, in order to get that buy-in, I kind of explained all the different kind of levers I was pulling on the e-com space and why this was applicable to their industry, within the AI space that they were in. And so, um, you know, results were pretty incredible. That's not always the case. That's definitely an outlier. But I think it's important to kind of call on some of that previous experience, share the strategic data around, why you think it should be explored, and finding, that incremental test strategy to get that buy-in across, whoever's necessary, to get that approval from.
I think that's great. Chelsea, Ben, you guys have anything to add on this one? All good. I think we're gonna transition it to how to design actionable experiments, which is, I don't know, I love this part. But how do you define an actionable experiment versus a vanity test? Danny, we go back to you. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Well, if you have a clear kind of metric that you're targeting, whether that's a ROAS lift or a CPA adjustment, for example, that's clearly a measurable test environment. Whereas if you're just looking at kind of impression lift or awareness or engagement across your campaigns, that's going to be a brand focused test. And so I think that, it really just depends on where you sit, within the company, and what stage the company's at, and how to dictate kind of which tests are most important. A lot of brands and companies actually can't afford to do big branded tests because the budgets aren't there. And so, moving the needle incrementally on, the more kind of strict guideline tests around performance metrics, that actually drive, business change, can often lead to you being able to do some more of those kind of vanity tests and vanity campaigns, as well.
Yeah, that's great. Any of the brands I talk to, they kind of almost all of them steer away from the vanity test. They're all just, it's the ROAS machine, right? We're putting money in, there needs to be some return. And to what Ben was saying earlier, it's like even if it's not on a channel specific basis, but an overall portfolio of what you're doing, measuring and looking at the ROI, I think everybody's looking at that. So it's interesting to think about vanity metrics where bigger brands I feel like used to look at that, but I mean, so many people are just on the ROI train.
But dollars have gotten tighter, right? And both on the consumer side and the brand side. So those performance metrics have gotten more important. And I think there's a weird kind of flip that happens too. So if you're in a brand new company, right, and you're just starting out and you're launching, your company, branding is very important. And there's a lot of organic tactics that you can put into place to drive more of those kind of vanity metrics and brand awareness. And so I think if you do that strategically enough, you might get a couple hits where you have, a ton of views or a ton of email engagement, or, you look at programmatic SEO as a path to organic growth, and look at kind of vanity metrics driven through those kind of organic methods. And that's something you can do for free, right? It just takes a lot of work, a lot of clear experimentation, and a little bit of luck. So that's the challenge. Whereas like if, there's no ad budget, that's where you got to double down on. And you can find success there, but it's just, once people start to see, or business owners start to see money coming in, ROAS targets being hit, or CPAs being hit, then it's hard to let go of that. And it's scary to let go
Yeah.
of that.
It's a
So
great point. Yeah, where you're at in the life cycle of the company is a great point too. Yeah. This is the famous CFO saying, is like, I'm not going to take likes or shares to the bank.
Right.
People-
But there, there's a brand called Transformer Table, and their whole business was all because they had a viral video that landed on YouTube and got millions of hits, and it drove essentially, it kickstarted the business to now they have, creative relationships with Marie Kondo, and they're
Oh, I
running
love it.
heavy paid media, but still relying a lot on that organic push. So I don't know. It's kind of it's a weird place to sit for any business, and it's
Yeah.
tough.
No, I love it. That's great. Yeah, the next question, I just love specific examples, right? But can you share an example of a test that generated real business insights versus one that fell flat? Chelsea.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about it. So I think going back earlier to this like concept of like asking questions to start a test. Well, I did that a few years ago with a big athletic apparel brand. They were launching like a high-end subdivision within the brand for, high-end sweaters and footwear and all of that. Um, we had a photo shoot coming up like a month after we wanted to launch this test, and we were trying to understand what we actually wanted to shoot that was going to perform well in that photo shoot. So we took all of our existing assets, um, categorized them in terms of whether they were on model, whether it was a flat lay, whether the background was white or black, broke that up by gender, and made sure the test was structured in a way so that we could say with confidence at the end of this, like, this particular type of asset drove the highest click-through rate and the highest sale rate. What we ended up seeing wasn't actually that clear cut. It was things like footwear performed really well when it was pictured on the model, whereas clothing did not. It was much better in a flat lay. So we used the design and then the learnings from that test to inform that photo shoot at the end. And that only happened because we started with what are the questions we're trying to answer and why are we trying to answer those questions, and that helped us like design a test in a way that made sense.
Awesome. Super intentional. Yeah, I like that. That's great. Um, Before we go on to the next question, Danny, Ben, anything from you guys? You don't have to.
I think that's the approach I've always taken too, and I think Chelsea knows what's up here.
That's great. Cool. So next question, what have you seen change when teams do adopt an experimentation culture as an ongoing process, or not culture, but as an ongoing process rather than a one-off project? So when teams do make this change, what have you seen that actually changes with the business?
I think the immediate thing, sorry to jump right in, but
Yeah.
this idea that you're sort of constantly iterating on something new, on some new concept somewhere within the business, I think elevates things further. The saying of rising tides raise all boats, or all the grains of sand make up the beach, like that kind of thing. Like I think it helps you as a team, as a brand, as a company, as a whoever you are, just do more than if you're in a more, I guess, complacent situation. You end up doing more than what you thought you could as a collective unit.
Yeah, that's great. Perfect. Well, I think that is all the questions that we have. I'm just looking over my notes. I mean, some themes that have come up that I think are super helpful is, having the freedom for you and your team to be able to execute, and there's a certain level of trust there. Talked a lot about like systems and platforms, which I think are helpful, but sounds like we shouldn't rely too heavily on them. Some great results that you guys shared specifics of, and like a lot of intentional and thoughtful like approaches to experimentation, but also culture. So I don't know. I think it was some really good, thoughtful answers there. So I appreciate the panel, and I appreciate all the um, the answers. And I think that wraps up everything that we had, Amanda. And I don't know if we had any Q&A because it's hard for me to see, but I'll hand it back off to you.
Yeah, no problem. I don't see any additional questions coming in. However, if you do have any questions for Mark or any of our panelists, feel free to throw them in the chat now, and we can address them after the webinar is over. And before we wrap up, just wanted to get everyone's feedback about how you thought the webinar performed. We always take this feedback to, help us obviously improve our webinars moving forward. So if you don't mind, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the best, how would you rate this session? So I'll leave this poll up for a little bit. And while you are filling that poll out, I did just put a link in the chat as well. So if you want to rewatch this webinar or sign up for any of our webinars later this week, that blog post kind of has a whole recap of all of the webinars going on as part of our Test Kitchen webinar series. So feel free to check it out and sign up for any webinars that are relevant for you. And Mark, I'm trying marshmallows on hot dogs. Yeah.
I mean, I went over here to see if there was any questions. It was the first thing I saw at the bottom of the list, and I was like, "Oh yeah, marshmallows and hot dogs."
Yeah,
Hot
no,
dogs
I know we have a little bit of time, so I did just see one question come in the chat. So given market changes, how do you typically rerun similar experiments to ensure the results still hold true? If so, how often do you recommend repeating them? So I'm not sure if anyone on this call wants to answer that or think about it for a little bit.
Yeah, I think that, you don't always have to necessarily market test as dead just because you didn't get the results that you thought you might. There's a lot of variables within that, right? So, for example, if it's a creative or copy test, it could be that you need to just change the individual that was in the creative or change the 3 seconds of the edit. So, that's the never-ending cycle of testing, right? You have to, and also to Chelsea's point, knowing exactly what you're testing, because then you can say, you're testing John's creative and you tested these thematics and you tested this editing style. And then, okay, maybe you're sticking with John because you believe that he's a great creator for you. And you then swap that out and change your editing style. And maybe it was an issue with the edit. One example, I'm running some campaigns now that I tested with specific copy and they did not work. And so I launched with, 4 different thematic types of copy focused on different verticals and different kind of persona perspectives. And now they're working. Same creative. So, you just don't really know. So kind of trying to break down if your budget allows you to, or just like Chelsea said, being very intentional with what you're testing so that you can get enough to, run that again in a month, or test that same exact experiment with a different person or different persona of copy, for example.
Absolutely. All right, I think with that, we're going to wrap up today's webinar. So wanting to thank all of our panelists, Chelsea, Ben, Danny, for all your amazing insights. And of course, Mark, for leading the charge and moderating our webinar today. As I mentioned in the beginning, we will be sending a link to the recording this afternoon, as well as that blog post I just sent in the chat. We'll be updating that with the webcast as well. So feel free, rewatch the webinar, sign up, or attend the other webinars we have going on this week. And yeah, with that, want to wish everyone a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you again tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.